I feel like everybody's right and everybody's wrong.
100%. Why is this important? Why are we even going here? He's helped a lot of guys. He's also not had success with a lot of guys.
Come in with a purpose, and they're very intentional with what they do and how they do it.
From the majors to the sandlot, baseball and softball share space in one place. Welcome to the farm system.
Fellas, and the ladies, welcome back to another episode of The Farm. Sitting down with my boy Cody Martin, and of course, Mr. Tankerson.
The real boy.
Joining us again, Tanky. Appreciate it. We have no idea what he's locked on.
He's on the camera.
Like he's on strict staring mode. I don't know what he is on right now, but he is locked on something.
The camera must look like a steak.
Yeah, something. That boy, he could look like a Pop-Tart, whatever it is. If it's food, he's in. Yeah. So, I feel him on that. So, Code, I started this conversation with Steve yesterday, and I thought that was pretty interesting. Just something that I was thinking about is early on in my coaching career, right? I always look back at like hitters I've had like over the years and all the stuff, right? And I remember at the time, like, because as you start working with hitters and you've been working with them for so many years and like all that stuff, right? It's like one of those things, how everybody says like you don't know what you don't know. Okay, great. But like also the fact of the more you know, the more you realize you don't know, right? And I think that's the thing is it also can be elusive for certain coaches is that now when I see movement, I just see so much complexity. Like so many things could be happening. Like there's just so much complexity all the time of like, we want to bucket it, we want to try to make it as simple as possible. We want to do these other things. But like in reality, if you get down to like the roots of like what's going on, obviously there's general stuff that works for a lot of like things that could really help. But if you wanted the exact thing that could help this person right now, the exact thing for them, not just the thing that they could process, the thing that they would connect with, the thing that, again, would be perfect for their body, the perfect, the way that you could explain it, your coaching style, like just all of these things, all this complexity, right? All that stuff, right? It's not like, oh, could I get it right over 4 months? But if I only had, like we often do, a couple days, right? And getting really elite at doing that and knowing what's going on with the body, like how complicated that is, right? So I was thinking about this, and I often will do this is I go and I look at older video of me working with hitters, and I remember watching a video at the time, and I'm like, oh man, like it's so nasty, right? And like it's good, right? But like I look back and I'm like, oh man, like there's things that can be even better, right? Now as I continue to grow as a coach, right? It's like when you look at your own swing back when you were playing, you were like, oh, it's pretty good, blah, 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 blah. And then you look at it later on, you're like, oh my goodness, like not even close. So that's why I also have like empathy too for people that are watching their swing and compare it to a pro, and they're like, look, it's like so similar. And it's like, you match some mannerisms, like yes, there's some pieces of it or whatever, right? There's certain frames. But with that being said, like the deeper I get into coaching, I realize like how much more complicated it is. And then also too, for me to like actually, instead of my feelings, like to actually go back and look at their, results that I was able to get with athletes, but comparatively to like what I can do now, because it can be elusive because you'd be like, man, like there still is like all these things that we want to clean up and like all this other stuff. But then go back and look and you're like, man, like you made some like crazy progress. And so one of the things I brought up with Steve the other day, I was like, Steve, you ever feel like that is that like one of the things that is a reminder for me is that as I've coached longer and longer, right, is that I start to realize as I coach longer and longer, I start to realize, again, not only the complexity, but I see it from a whole different depth. And because I see it for so many depths and there's so many complexities of problems to solve and what might work and like how we would go about attacking it and all the different things that be going on. Like the more you learn about the body, the more you learn about training, the more you learn about, constraints and like all this other stuff, right? The more, again, you can start to realize like, man, like I've learned so much, but also at the same time, like there's still obviously so much always to learn. And there's so much more complexity like to the body. And so I was just having that conversation with him, and I was like, man, like that'd actually be a pretty good conversation for us to have like on the podcast of obviously how much you've learned over the last couple of years, but then also with that being said, right, too, is like that process of how I'm feeling compared to like the truth of, you know, what's happened like year over year or things that you've learned or, you know, whatever, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly what you just said. Like, I remember playing, because I know me personally, like the quickest one I can go back to is like me playing a few years ago and thinking like, yep. And I go back and look at my swing and I'm like, dear Lord, how did I hit? You know, it's like just like knowing what I know now, what I would try to. But there's also there's been a lot of situations too where I know my brain wants it to look a particular way, but it's not necessarily aesthetically what it looks like that makes somebody hit. You know, like first one I think of was like Hunter Pence hit, but he didn't always look, you know, like I never would try to mimic Hunter Pence's swing, but if I hit like Hunter Pence in the MLB, I'd be pretty happy result wise, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think too, there's just like so many different directions you can go, you know, with that. But, you know, I think the biggest thing, just from everything that I've learned is, and it's funny because it sounds like you're never really giving yourself any credit ever, just like the way I think about it is like when I run into a block, like let's say I'm trying to get somebody to do a particular move and I can't get them to do it, or for whatever reason. And sometimes too, like they just need to do it again tomorrow. Sometimes like their brain isn't allowing it. Sometimes like how I'm communicating it is the problem, right? Like there's so many reasons why like what I want them to do, it isn't happening. But then also too, I think one of the biggest things is like when I run into like a block like that, there could be so many reasons of why it's whatever I want to happen isn't happening. And sometimes like I view it as like maybe I just didn't know enough about the body and like I need to learn more. And then, you know, I'll go another route is I'll just go like in a particular session is like, okay, maybe I'll stop talking about like the particular move that's happening or whatever, and we'll talk like, you know, approach, which is then like, okay, I'm meeting them where they're at. Like, okay, maybe you need to think about hitting the top of the ball or something. You know, it's like you know, which influences movement. But to a lot of people, it's like, well, that's my approach. That's what, like, you know, I'm attacking the top of the ball. It's like, I want to be a ground ball hitter, you know, like stuff like that. And it's like, I can view that one way of like, okay, I couldn't get him to do what I was trying to get him to do. So I'll take a different route to get them results now. So we're not failing too much. But then also too, there's the perspective of like, that really did get him to move in a different way by telling him to hit the top part of the ball. So I think it's just like I don't know. There's just like a lot of gray area in that of like, you know, I don't know, whatever you want to see, you see most of the time. And like, so if I'm looking at, cause there'll be times that I'll be working on something in the cage with a hitter, right? And you'll come in and give, usually, right? You'll give something like similar cause you're listening and you're like, okay, I know what they're working on. But sometimes there's been instances where like, maybe I'm focused on their lower half in a particular move and you'll come in and be like, hey, try this with your grip. And I'm like, I haven't even looked above his waist, you know, anything like there's something with what he's doing with his lower half that I felt like was, you know, my priority right there. And so I think sometimes too, it's like, what are you focused on and like what's on your mind right now? And you'll start to see that type of stuff too. So I'm like, I look back at, you know, we're doing our little vlogs, right? I look back at swings and I'm like, okay, the swing looks like crap, you know, as like a whole. But I was like, I know in these particular swings, I'm working on this, and like, I guess it did get better, you know, because I'm looking for that. But if I wasn't looking for it, my first instinct is like, it was just a terrible swing. It's like it just looked like crap. But also having that context and that perspective. So I mean, you know, just as I continue to learn more and whatnot, it's hard even myself going back and looking at some hitters that I've trained, like, and I look back at them, I'm like a year ago, I'm like, wow, was I really that far off? But, you know, I'm probably going to do the same thing a year from now with the same hitters and look back and be like, wow, was I really push them in the wrong direction? But it's like, you know, am I looking at it from a different perspective? Did I learn more? Like, was that good for where they were? You know, it's like the further you get from when they first started with you to, you know, where you're at now, it's like, you can lose sight of where they started. And, you know, so I don't know. I think it's definitely like a messy, you know, cycle that you get into where, you know, I just kind of got to remind myself when I'm in there is like, I'm just doing what I feel like is right at that point in time and like what my game plan is to like get them the best results now. you know, based on the information I have, like if they only are going to be here for 2 days, you know, that's a different game plan compared to like, hey, I'm going to be here all off season, you know? And so, you know, sometimes we take more macro, micro approach, but.
Yeah, no, I was going to say also not to make it sound too like, we're also not in there just like flying by the seat of our pants, right?
Yeah.
Just like making shit up. Like, and what I mean by that is like, you know, for example, for the example, like with that, right? Like there is like big major blocks and things that we're focusing on. Now the strategies and methods are many, right? Of like ways of getting there and different ways of like navigating, but also like at the same time, you know, for example, right? It's like, what is a major block and like what, for what player at what time? It might be his mindset, might be a massive thing. So we might be doing a competition in a certain particular way, or we might be, you know, doing something with this athlete particularly because we know that it would have a bigger impact on this particular athlete, right? So I think it's like one of the things of like keeping like is in mind, like, you know, like when I go through things, like, yes, there's a large focus, like again, foundation, like stable, like base of like lower half and like all these other things of like how they're utilizing and how their pelvis is moving, right? Like I'm very mindful of like what's going on there and the limitations and things like with that as well. But also too, everything affects everything, right? So if there's something downstream that's affecting something upstream, like we, you know, a lot of people think everything's just domino effect, whatever happens at the beginning, that then, you know, it's going to predict what's happening down below. It's like, yes, but at the same time, like, again, if there's a buildup and there's a dam that's been created or whatever, it's going to back up the water and it's going to change what's happening upflow as well. It's going to create new channels. It's going to create new routes. It's going to create other stuff. So like, for example, like if you have a limitation like me, right? Like I have a limitation in like my right arm, right? Where I have restrictions where I can't turn my wrist, you know, all the way over and get my palm, if you're not watching, my palm like flat to the ground, right? So again, like more like pronation, like some of those things like that I have some restrictions there. Now, because of a surgery I had when I was younger, like when I was in college, like all the things. And so because of that, my body has to find a way around that, right? If I have a limitation in my front hip, right, I could be trying to train the beginning part of the swing all I want over and over and over and over and over again. But the problem is my body will never get into that position to ever get into my front hip ever because there's pain there. And if I did that, I would hurt myself or whatever. And the body's going to avoid that. Right. And so like, because of that, and some of these things you have to like keep in mind is like this other thing of being like, you know, I'm seeing how everything is moving. Like, you know, for example, I kind of think of it like, almost too, like if you're watching, sometimes I'll bring up like a routine, like if it's a dance routine, if it's a cheerleading routine, if it's you know, an orchestra like playing and there's a certain part of music that they keep getting stuck at or something, right? How you started the music, yes, it leads into that. Are you on time? All these other things, right? Like, are you in the position that you need to be in so that you can execute the next move? All of that is still important for sure. And it's not this or that is more important. It's what's causing the problem, you know? And so if there's a problem that's happening, if that one piece of it is causing the problem, like we're going to go in and we'll attack that one thing because that happens to be the big meat and potatoes, like at the time, right? And so limitation-wise, and also too, like, you know, I almost think of it like a doctor. Like if you're a doctor and you're trying to help this person, right? You're going to go with, there isn't just like, yes, good, like again, as you become a better doctor, you get better at prescribing, you know, like in identifying like what's wrong and diagnosing what is wrong. And then like you think of it like a car tech, right? The same thing. Car tech, if you bring a really good mechanic, the better the mechanic is, the better they are at identifying what the real issue is and not one of the symptoms, right? And so, because again, you go in there and they go, oh, it's your battery, right? And then you replace your battery, and then you go back in again and they go, oh, it's, you know, your battery again, or oh, it's because you park outside in the heat, or oh, it's because this, and this, and like meanwhile, it's like, you know, your alternator, or you know, again, that actually, then they go the alternator, like you replace your whole alternator, and then it's like, oh, actually, 6 months ago or whatever, I like bottomed out the car and somehow like, you know, cut a wire inside the car or whatever, and it's been leaking in, like, you know, like now this other thing, and like it's a wiring issue there. If there's something going on where like it's like a light's on all the time and it's just draining the battery at night, and it's like you go down the most logical ways of diagnosing is like you go down your like when I was in school, I never thought I'd use this, but this is a good example. Is when I was in high school, I took alternative fuels, which is, yes, we did things with solar and like all that other stuff. But one of the things that we used to do is we would just work on cars, right? So we'd have these like diagnostic sheets, right? And like protocol, and like we would go down like the most likely things to be wrong, right? It doesn't mean that that's what's wrong. It's like we would go test it. Like, is that what really is wrong, right? Is that something that is really the problem? And again, like you could replace it, but then you also have to weigh in, right? Like replacing an alternator isn't cheap,
Right.
right? Like you doing this, doing that, like these things also aren't cheap. So that's where having a good mechanic and not fixing things that are not actually the problem can be very, very useful. And I think the same thing with that is like we also always expect that every mechanic I go to is going to have the same findings, and like they're not, right? The more skilled my mechanic is, right, the better they are. And also too, you can go to a cheaper mechanic. You can go to a cheaper doctor. You can like go to a third world country and go to a cheaper doctor that doesn't have the same training and all the other stuff and all these other things. And like, great. Like, but again, they might diagnose you with something, that's completely off base. And like you spend all this money, you could actually even make yourself more sick. You could do all these other things. And like, that happens a lot in a swing. And so what you're doing on the same side of that is like, you're paying for the experience and the expertise, right? And you're right. Like that's ever evolving. That's ever evolving. And that's always getting better and changing over time. But also with that being said too, as well, is like, again, like what we're addressing and what I've learned to do as well is just being better at diagnosing what is wrong. And in the beginning, most mechanics tend to find the same things, or like we always talk about that as like batted ball result or bat path, right? Everybody sees the bat path. Everybody sees it cutting across. Everybody sees it doing this, this, and this. Some of the bigger parts of the swing, but it's like usually we're talking about contact. Like that's so far downstream. And then like, yes, that is a symptom. That is something that we need to pay attention to. It is an important data point. It is, all these things that it tells us a lot about what's going on. But when I want to address and change what's going on at that point, I might change something in a whole nother way. I might give them a destination cue, which happens to be after contact, or I might give them initial cue from the very get-go of what's starting and say, hey, your initial move, I want you to feel like you're doing a pistol squat when you first start, right? And they can both work, right? It just depends on like, well, what's the issue? What's causing what's happening at contact? And also, obviously, with your experience, making the best guess of like what that actually is. You get what I'm saying? And so, and I know, and I've seen you do that process, but I just wanted to add context. 'Cause I know like someone just like listening, going like, no, we're not in there. Just like, like Codee's speaking from a place of like expertise, right? Like Codee's speaking from a place of like, hey, like I've learned to, again, be able to not be so locked in on what I might have, like for sure this might be the thing, and like be able to be more fluent, as a coach too.
I'll use like this morning session for an example. It's like we want to be so it looks like this. I got to get to this spot. Like we want a parameter for it to be in, right? And like for example, he was like, I got to get to this spot, and I was like, okay, get to that spot. I was like, but again too, like today and tomorrow, then off to spring training. So it was kind of like Padres, dude. But where I was like, hey, you lead the session. You do it. Well, and
Chase.
Right. And I was like, okay, get to that width. Let's see how it goes, right? And like you could just start seeing the realization of like, it's not the same spot every time, And then it was like 10 minutes later, he's like, well, then I didn't get as wide and I felt like it got better. And then like these ones, I felt like I got wide. And I'm like, yeah, because I can go back and look at these and like, generally speaking, are you in a similar area and like you got slack pulled out? For sure. But are you landing in the exact same spot with the exact same orientation every single swing? No. And if you are, you're really, really like you're a robot, there's an always changing environment that we're stepping into when we get in the box, from like angles to speeds to your timing to all of that. It could be the exact same pitch. You might have started a split second later. That changes everything. For sure. Right. And like, kind of walking through that process of like,
and while that at the same time, while the task is slightly different every single time, it's also not badminton.
No,
right? So like I think that's always good context too in the same side of that, where it's like a lot of times like where people will take that so far is of being like, well, it's, a completely different task every single time. It's like, well, I didn't start playing ping pong. Like it's not that different of a task. He still's got to throw it over this damn plate. Like it is, yes. Is there variance in the angles and all the things? And is there going to be variance? Yes. Also too, just because it's going to be slightly different every time doesn't mean, like, for example, like if you watch Kobe Bryant take a shot, right? Like his 3-pointer, like, is every single one of them slightly different? Yes. But at the same time, Kobe looks at Kobe, right? Like when he shoots his threes, like where his elbow, generally his position, maybe it's a 1 degree this way, 1 degree that way, like whatever. Maybe again, he got a little bit more bend in his knees that time. The last time he didn't. Maybe this time he came off of a dribble. And so it's like slightly different. But at the same time, like, and also too in a sport that has so many variables, that I'm trying to be as consistent as possible. Now that doesn't mean, and again, like you're saying, it doesn't mean that I should try to sit here and be a robot and I need to do the exact same thing every time. But sometimes in the search of that consistency, it gets me generally where I'm not all of a sudden landing open completely on one swing and then completely, my technique is completely different on every single ball that I'm hitting.
Yeah. And then it's like more, and that was more of like, it's okay for it to not be the exact same swing on a curveball low and away as it is a fastball middle in, like we're doing slow loopy 100%. Curveball low and away.
Yeah, you're not going to have the same swing on a ball up and in and down and out.
No,
like
they're two different pitches, right? And I think about this old thing. I think my dad told me this back when I was first started like golfing. Was I would putt and I would take one ball and I would just putt, and wherever it would land, I would go get it. And I'd get it out of the hole if I made it, and I'd take it somewhere else, right? And he's like, you just practice 500 putts one time. Yeah. And I was like, okay. And he was like, take a bunch of balls and putt from the same spot 50 times, then move the spot. Yeah. He was like, and then my argument was like, well, I'm not a good enough chipper to get it to that one spot, so I want to work. And he was like, yeah, but now you're a master at nothing. Yeah. At least if you put the ball on the green and this area, right, with, I'm playing on very, very bad golf courses. They're not professional, like pretty flat. He's like, that you have a few putts that you can go to that if you put it in that general area, you got a shot, right? And I think about that for like basketball, like, you have particular parts of the court that that you're going to get shots at.
I go to the corner. Like, this is where I shoot from.
Right? And it's like, I'm really good at those shots.
Yeah, Ray
right?
Allen.
And like that consistency, right, is like, Ray Allen, Shane Batty, I'll start listing off guys, right? Really good at particular spots, but also too, like, they hit threes regardless of where they were.
But everybody's got a spot that they
and it's
tend
like,
to
okay,
drain
so there's
more
some
often.
consistency, right? Yeah. There's something that like I particularly focused on, like I'm trying to be consistent with, but that consistency allowed them that when variables did happen, they were still pretty dang good at shooting threes at the top of the key.
Yeah, and literally to that point again, there's a time for blocked practice, which is, we have some stuff coming out here soon. Not soon, but soon-ish on, some of the skill acquisition stuff. There's a time for block programming and practicing, which is like very like what you said, right? It's like, okay, from one spot and all that stuff. But then there's also a time where like I need to continue to blend into, because there is a lot of variables. Like you said, like I'm not going to land in the same spot every time. Or we were just watching golf yesterday, right? And we were watching, the celebrity, where they're using one club for the whole time or whatever, right? So it's like, you take Rory, McIlroy, right? And he's over there putting with his 3-wood, it's just like, it's just like, again, like that variability, and he's still like sinking putts. But now also too, all the other, like a lot of them started missing and doing other things. But like the whole point there is like, there's a time where I'm working on my consistency. Like, for example, like, okay, all right, I can do this. I can do this skill. If the ball happens to be like right here in this area, and then I get really good at that. Okay, when you master, like when you can drain like 7 out of 10 of those putts, right? Then you don't just, now all of a sudden you start going into 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10. Like, great, you like, okay, you're that good. It's like, yeah, but like now let's go a slightly different spot on the green, or a little further, a little closer, or again, like just a little part of the green where it rolls a little to the left or whatever, right? And you start adding all these different variables rather than, like you said, right? If I just go out there and I'm learning how to putt, and I just have random balls all over the place, like it sound like, again, in reality, like, yeah, I would have to do this and that. And it's like, yeah, but in reality, there's so many variables and you happen to be one of the biggest variables because you have no motor control.
Right.
Like you don't know, right now, you can't hit. If I told you to putt this ball 4 feet over and over again, you one time are going to hit it 5 foot.
Yeah.
The next time we're going to hit it 3.5. You have no consistency of just hitting a ball 4 feet just by itself, like just from a skill standpoint. Right. And so, this was actually a really good point. Someone made, I was listening to the other day on Instagram. He said there's a big difference between training and skill development, where training, you never want it to get easier, right? The whole point is to continuously change the environment where it never all of a sudden becomes easy. I'm always challenging myself. Like I want the adaptation of the tissue and progressive overloads and all those things and stimulus and all that stuff, right? But when it comes to like skill development, I want that skill, that 4-foot putt or whatever, to become so easy. Right. Like the whole goal is for that to become really easy, right? And so you could bring that into like the weight room, for example, and say like, okay, these squats or whatever at this weight, this becomes easy. Yes, but for example, skill, I might be upkeeping that skill. Like I never all of a sudden want to like lose that or any of those other things. And yes, I want to continue to progress off of that. But one of the things is just a different mindset is like, okay, is this more of a training approach, right? Where like I'm learning a new skill and I'm pushing it, right? Like we always talk about like, that, am I trying to go, am I again in that? And I think that's such a good ratio that we talk about too as well. And this is not something like we made up. This is from skill acquisition science, right? Is that if we're successful, less than less than like 6 out of 10, right? It's usually probably a little too challenging, right? Like if it's 4 out of 10, and again, like when it talks about skill, not about like game, right? Like where you're like, oh, well, I'm 3 out of 10, baseball, like that's a good thing. It's like, yeah. But again, we're talking about skill development, like how good specifically when we're training like a skill and we're progressing like all the way up and like all that stuff is that, again, if I'm over 6 or 7 out of 10, right, then it's too easy, right? So, and that's where you monitor that. And that little 6 or 7 out of 10 to me always, and again, maybe 5, 6, 7 out of 10 depends on the athlete like I'm working with, right? Can they handle that failure? Are they actually learning anything from this? Are they just compensating to get those other reps? What is the actual, and again, the task to me is not, can we just hit this line drive? A lot of people just settle with that because like, I get it. Like, yeah, I can compensate and just smash the line drive here. The problem is when that ball is not coming 15 miles an hour and it has a slight cut on it and it goes from this angle, I'm trying to create more room for error because I can do it when this ball is coming 15 and I have a large window of time to hit this ball how I want to hit it. But in reality, I'm in and out of the zone. And when I go and face higher levels of progression, I don't do front toss. And this is where everybody, again, like hates on front toss or hates on tee or hates on these other things, right? Is they want to go, well, yeah, but like it's going to be way easier so you can get away with things in X, Y, and Z. It's like, yeah, but that's the problem. You're applying a task concept from really hard machine work or all these other things and going, if you just hit a line drive here, you won in competition type work to front toss. When in front toss and all those things, I'm worried about me. I'm trying to be really consistent. There's a reason why every single day, like we talk about, is martial arts every single day, right? They do shadow boxing work. They hit pads. They hit bag. They do all these things that are lower progressions, right? And then they blend it up and then they go into their fights and they do that stuff every single day at Staples, right? Same thing. There's a reason why Kobe every day would go out and make the most basic shots over and over and over and over again, right? Where by the time he's in the game, he's like, I've made this shot, 10,000 times in my life, or like again, like he's got it down, like with a spin move, with all the exact intensity, all the stuff that he would go in and make that shot over and over and over again, right? Like, yes, is it way harder in a game when the pressure is on, when the lights are on, when the game's on the line, when the fans are all there, when the coach of the team's dependent on you and all the things? Like, yes, but again, along with that, like Kobe there's a time where he's doing blocked practicing and there's times where he's adding a whole bunch of variables and then he's changing it up and he's going to slightly more this way, slightly more that way. Like, and then, like I think you might've brought that up the other day where it's like, again, when I first start shooting, even like when you play like around the world, right? Well, you start with the most basic shot first, right? And then you progress and you get further and further around, right? And you work it all the way up, and then you start adding time variables, then you start doing these things. And then, you know, also the big piece, like we talked about too, right? Like, again, when this one I think is always hits home with everybody, because everybody knows this skill, like learning to drive your car, right? Nobody would get their kid, put them in the car their first time and go, all right, it's icy on the freeway. There's a massive storm coming through. Oh yeah, here's a tornado. All these, like, let's add all these crazy variables, right? There's the Super Bowl this weekend. Let's go on the freeway and let's teach you how to drive. Nobody would do that.
Yeah.
Now, is that the task I'm going to have to do at some point in my life?
Right.
For sure, right? But also too, this is another thing. For example, my mom's getting older, her vision's not as good, all these things. My mom at this point in her life, she has so many years of experience and so many things that have, you know, happened where she's learned all these driving skills, right? But she's getting older and her vision's not as good. So she tries to avoid driving at night. She tries to avoid going places that she doesn't know how to get to by memory, because looking down at her phone and then looking back up the street, she might get into a car accident. But she has way more driving experience than I do. Right. And so I think that that's also, again, like as athletes get older and other things, right? Like you're not capable of doing what you used to do. And so that changes your game plan too. But when we all learn how to drive, again, we're usually in an empty parking lot in the middle of nowhere, right? Trying to avoid, again, if there's one pole in the parking lot, like let's stay away from the pole because we'll find a way to hit it.
Oh yeah.
Right. And so we're doing everything we can in super controlled environments that are nowhere near realistic. Right. That's the point. That's literally the point, is so that I can focus on me and not all these other variables. And then I slowly add more variables. Okay, now let's drive around. Like I used to drive, literally learn how to drive in Cheyenne's high school's parking lot. Right. And then when I learned how to park there, and I used to park the car, and then my sister would make me drive around the block and not drive around the parking lot, and then park in another spot and park in another spot and park in another spot, in and out. Right. Like that's just what I used to. And then it was like, okay, now let's drive around the school. There's a couple stop signs. There's a couple other things. Right. And then like, okay. And then slowly, okay, now let's drive through this block, or okay, drive us home, or do other things. Right. And then it slowly got more and more and more. Right. And I also grew up driving like go-karts and stuff like that, right? And all these things helped me learn to like avoid collisions and other things. And when I was in a go-kart, guess what? I ran into stuff. I flipped it a couple times. I did other stuff. You know what I'm saying? So I think, again, along with that is like everybody tries to go like, see, this is why externals work, and this is why block practicing is the best. Well, if you get the right example, and I give the study, if I give the study, oh, I'm teaching you, like, let's see what's the best way to teach you, and you've never driven before, and I put you on the freeway, or I make you do a parking lot and then progress it up, everybody's going to go, oh, blocked is so amazing. And, you know, get on the freeway had no value. No, that's a dumb study. That's not very useful. But also too, if I take someone that has a bunch of experience or does whatever, and like I'm looking at how much skill you developed over time, and I'm like trying to challenge, you know, like your skill development, and I'm putting these task work and I'm doing these other things, like for sure that has value too. It just matters like who and the variables and the context and all the stuff, right? And also too, if I do block practicing and I go, I've read studies like this too. This will tell you like the limits of science studies that you keep reading and everybody likes to quote all the time.
Review processes.
Okay. So then people go, okay, well, I practiced this in a parking lot and now I'm on the freeway and I can't do the skill. Bro, you went straight from the parking lot, straight back to the freeway in a storm with all the things. You're being a lazy coach. You didn't blend it. You didn't progress it. The problem isn't the lower progression. The problem is that we didn't blend it up.
Yeah.
And you didn't get it up to what the task is actually going to have to be. Yeah. If your task is actually having to hit 95 miles an hour, right? Well, it's like, yeah, I do need to blend up and I do need to be able to get to that. Now, again, here's another thing though I think is different. While a lot of people agree with that and they would go like, oh yeah, that's why we hit 95 off the machine every day and all that other stuff. It's like, yeah, but the difference is for example, I say this all the time. When people always say this with like pro guys, they're like, oh yeah, well he's got to face 95 and all those other things, blah, blah, blah. Bro, he faces 95 every night.
Yeah, I was going to say.
He's not missing 95. We can practice it in game
500
every
at
single
bat.
night.
Yeah.
Every single night. So I'm not worried about those other things. He's getting skill development. He's getting it in game. He's trying to do what we've been doing outside as we blended it up into the game too. So me sitting here in practice every day, shooting extra 95s at him doesn't necessarily mean that means, especially too, if that guy has to work on, for example, if you were going to, like, let's say you knew how to drive, A lot of people do. Like right now, I'd say even in Vegas specifically, because we don't have to do it very often. All these people know how to drive, right? But specifically within driving, do you know how to parallel park? Now, what would we do? But you're a really good driver. But I might take you back to that parking lot. Let's learn how to parallel park with two little bumpers. Like, how about you, Nikki P? Parallel park? Yeah, that's a no.
She said I'm walking a long way.
So exactly, right? So my point is you could be driving, but parallel parking, right? There's people that literally just completely avoid it, right? Even though they know how to drive, but they don't have that very specific skill. So same thing with the hitters. It's the same thing. They might know how to hit, but maybe they're terrible on a certain pitch shape. Maybe they don't know how to create a solution. And like a couple years ago, this would be a perfect thing too, is a couple years ago, the Giants had a little thing where Dustin Lin was in the dugout, and one of the guys struck out, and he came in the dugout, and Dustin Lin said to him, "We haven't developed a solution for that yet." Right? Within his moves. It doesn't mean the guy couldn't hit. Right? He just didn't have a solution to that type of pitch type. So if you have a guy that's like low slotted, like Scherzer, low slot, like he throws like low but high, like good ride, and he has a lot of spin rate, like those are the guys are weird. Usually it's like, an over the top guy or something like that. Like guys like that, or Sale, or some of these guys, right? It's like, okay, that's a very unique problem.
Yeah.
Right. And we have to create solutions for that. Right. But generally, when we're working with hitters and things like that as well, it's very different when we're trying to add parallel parking compared to we're trying to teach you how to drive, period. You get what I'm saying? But there's some overlap between the skills, right? But again, for certain athletes, once you get them generally moving pretty good, then you might be focused on something very specific. And then somebody goes, see, this is why this works so much. And it's like, yeah, but you're laying, like, for example, if I stack bat speed on top of already a really good movement pattern, okay, it could be super useful. And we'd be like, okay, that's not a bad thing. The problem is most people that are just solely chasing like bat speed, for example, have terrible movement, and then they're just doing it worse. They're just doing it faster, right? So again, it sounds good, but again, you're just getting out quicker, right? A lot of times you're just hitting ground balls, you're having harder ground balls. That's great. But again, at the end of the day, like, okay, I have to learn how to do it and hit it at certain angles and have certain spacing and like all these other things, right? If I have there's plenty of dudes that have really high bat speeds, whole another thing, different rabbit hole. But my point is, again, along with that is like, there's a time, there's a season, there's wisdom to all of those things. They all work, right? But at the same time, for example, this guy, it's like even a, what's the saying? Like even a blind squirrel finds a nut every once in a while.
Yeah.
Right? It's like if you go at everything with a hammer, you're gonna find nails. Right? You're gonna find nails, and you're gonna be like, oh man, this works so well. Like this does so good. Like X, Y, and Z. Like, see, externals are so amazing. And this is what even in my own career, like I've learned as a coach, is like I'll run down a rabbit hole and be like, oh man, this is so amazing. It's just like there's holes in it. There's holes in it. There's holes in it. There's holes in it.
Yeah.
Right. And the wisdom is more in the middle, right? Of knowing what to do at what time. It all works and it all sucks. One of my first presentations I ever made to pro organizations, right, is everything works, everything sucks, right? Anything, the greatest medicine in the world used at the wrong time for the wrong diagnosis, right? Like it's wrong, right? It doesn't mean that you should never use that with anybody. It just means that in this circumstance, it was like misapplied or whatever, right? And so that's where I think the complexity becomes difficult. And, again, if we're actually trying to help, let's go back to the doctor analogy real quick too, right? Yeah, no. And then going back to the doctor analogy, I think the other thing is that's super, big here is, right, is like, like, especially like specialty problems. Like I always kind of think of, like I told you, I like to watch that show House, right? Is one thing I like about that show, right, is like, okay, they're trying to figure out, like a lot of doctors have tried this problem because we all think, oh, if I go to a doctor, like everything's going to be good. Like, no, there's specialists. Like, for example, like my dad, for example, like he had a lot of health issues, like at the time when he was like diagnosed with cancer and like all these other things. And so like they had a specialist, like we had to go to UCLA, right? Like we couldn't do it here in Vegas. There was nobody that could serve him here, right? So, and if we would have served him here, like they would have diagnosed them with things that they were familiar with or whatever, right? But in reality, like we had to go, those are the top people, like, anywhere close that were, that could help him. And so I think that that's the other thing as well. It's like, like body is extremely complex and really unique, especially when it comes to performance. We're not talking about just surviving, right? Doctors you're like trying to survive. get you to a decent spot where we're talking about like hitting and performance. Like that's a whole nother thing. Like what is your best performance that we can get you to? How good could you be? It's like, that's just a whole nother like planet. Right. And that's where like the experience and all those things come in, as being like, again, like we're partnering to figure out for you what is the biggest things and what's the focus on at what time, like you said, because right now, yeah, you know what, your lower half isn't moving too well, but if like, you know, again, like we get your D cells in there, we get your lower body a little bit more stable, like all these other things, right? Some bigger blocks out of the way. It really can, you know, help just in general, I think is big.
Yeah. And it's like, and that's the art of coaching there too, is like, okay, maybe this really does need to get figured out based on the information that we know and what you're focused on and what you need. Like maybe this does, but also too, maybe there's an emotional side that you're not handling the failure super well. So we need to go to something different, let you feel good about it again, be successful for 10, 15 minutes, and then go back to it, you know, and like, you know, there's some give and take. And then there's some times where it's like, all right, like you know, I hate doing this one, but it's like sometimes you just think you're better than you are. You know, sometimes you don't think you're that good. You're stuck in the mindset of somebody, your old self that wasn't that good, and now you are better. You know, it's like, and a balance in that too, and like bringing, you know, hey, like, yeah, 2 years ago you were here and you couldn't do this, and this is all you could do really well. It's like, but this is 2 years later now. You can do all these things that you just said you couldn't do 2 years ago, maybe, but you're a different hitter now. You're a different athlete now. Or, hey, like, you know, my favorite is all the high school guys think that they can come in and hit 95. It's like, oh, I can hit 95. It's like, none of you guys have hit 95 before.
Y'all
like,
have to
prove it.
Y'all are
right?
having trouble hitting 82.
Yeah, it's like, so hey, like, I think you guys think you're better than what you guys are. Like, I don't think you guys realize how hard hitting 95 is consistently, especially too, like, you're 15. I don't expect you to be able to hit 95 all the time. Like, you know, that balance too, where, you know, sometimes the answer isn't even to talk about that particular, you know, movement solution with him at the time, so that we can get the ego and the emotional side back to where we need it to then go back after that.
And as I've seen you do, like really well, and I think one thing that we really do too, it's like, we're not just doing one thing.
Never.
Development is all of it.
Never.
I'm helping him with spiritually where he's at, right? Like, I'm helping him mentally with how he processes things and how he thinks. I'm helping him physically, you know, all these things as well. And also too, like throughout that whole process, like we're building a mentality, we're doing all these other things, right? And development is all of these things put together, right? And so like, for example, it's like, yeah, there is a time where, you know, for example, there is a time where we might need to think more mentality right now. And I have to really help them with their mentality, right? And that's maybe a bigger block for them that's really holding them back. There's times where, for example, one of the biggest things that's holding somebody back is defensively, they're terrible. Or again, maybe they're strength-wise, right? It's like they're just so damn weak, right? They're just so weak. And again, they're playing at a level that it's like, you know, for example, like, you know, we always talk about this, like there's, you know, 13-year-olds that are just way more physically developed than other, you know, and 13-year-olds. And like part of the thing is like a lot of times I'm like walking parents off the cliff where I'm like, hey, like, you know, like, listen, back away from the cliff. Like everything's okay. Your kid just literally just needs a little testosterone. Like let his body mature a little bit. Right. And some of these growing pains this year might really suck. The next 2 years might really suck. Right. And he might be all over the place. And then all of a sudden, I've seen it so many times. And then the player is like, they're a senior and like, oh man, you're so good now. And they can process all these other things and amazing, all this stuff. And everybody's journey is different. Some people, that doesn't happen until they get into college or later in college when they mature or like whenever. Right. And so they can be more late bloomers. And so I think a lot of times too, as well, is, you know, again, like all of that and just like what's different, for each player. And again, that's where it comes in like the art side of like what I'm focused on. Right. And I think, you know, along with that, right, is like, just like a doctor, like, what are we going to pay attention to? Is it are they telling me like, hey, yes, you're having all these problems, but the main thing here, I'm going to give you some medicine to help with some of these symptoms, suppress, but this isn't an answer, right? This is just to suppress some of these symptoms, but we need to change your diet. And we need to start exercising 3 times a week and doing these other things. These are to help suppress some of the symptoms, but is not a long-term solution, and or you're going to have to take these for the rest of your life if you don't actually change your lifestyle, your habits, and hang-ups, etc. You know what I'm saying? And then to be able to do that, your diet, your food, all those other things, it might be interconnected with what's going on with you spiritually. Right? So then we might have to go to the root cause of that. Might just be another symptom.
Yeah.
And we have to go back to like, what's the root here so that we can fix, and then all of those things then, fall. Right. But it doesn't mean, okay, if they have the spiritual thing that's going on or doing whatever, it doesn't mean that this medicine isn't important. Because it might clear some of the fog. It might take care of some of these symptoms here where like you would give a little bit extra time. Like, for example, maybe something what it's doing is it's draining your energy or doing X, Y, and Z, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, well, I can give you like, for example, I can take an energy drink, or I could do something that supplements, in that same way, right? I can give you a little glucose hit or something, right? Like, great. But at the end of the day, like, you got to take all those things and like realizing I don't have to do one thing at a time. Again, very school thought where it's like, it's this or that, or I got to do, well, I'm working on this right now and I'm solely focused. It's like, no, like I'm targeting this, but at the same time, I don't like not care about the kids spiritually. Like I don't not care about what is going on mentality. Like we're talking about all those things like all the time, but there's certain things that are being more targeted at different times of the year, at different times in their development. Maybe I've been coaching them for longer, so I can say something now that I couldn't say 4 months ago. They trust me more. Like we've developed a relationship, so I can say, what is needed to be said, and maybe I've said it a whole bunch of different ways, but now when I say it, it means more to them,
right? Because
I've developed a relationship, and so I have the space to say something that I couldn't say 4 months ago. Or I would have said it, but it would have went in and out of his ear, right? Now he hears me.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I was gonna say, I think too, like everybody wants to bucket and wants to put them in a box or say, hey, oh, those are movement guys, or like, hey, we're really good at coaching aerials or terrestrials, or hey, we're mindset people, hey, we're kickback people, all these things, right? But it's like the truth is, I'm not doing any of those things, just one of those things. Anytime I step foot in the cage,
no,
ever.
I'm combining
literally
everything
ever.
Always. Mixed martial artist, baby.
Sometimes, not intentionally. But a lot of times I try to be intentional, right? Or I reflect and I'm like, okay, that was a really big unlock. I need to be more intentional about how I use that skill. Like for example, sometimes there's points within a session that I'll bring up conversation for 30 seconds about football, right? Oh, did you see what, the Jets said about that? To get their mind from being so negative or stuck on a thought, or like again, right? That's me training okay, how do I separate from what I'm emotionally feeling right now? Okay, let's get back into it.
Sometimes I sit there and you see me do it. Sometimes I'll laugh at them. Like they usually miss it a ball, and usually they'd be furious, and I'll just laugh. I'll just be like, or I'll be like, I know that girl. Like I know that guy. Like, just like, again, teaching them or, and I've seen you do this exact same thing. And this is what I love about coaching too, is a lot of times like I'll ask them things and they'll like, so like player will be like, oh, I hate when you do this. And it's like, yeah, I'm doing it on purpose. Right. Like again, that's the point. It's like, you hate when I do it, but you also know, like, I'm actually teaching you a skill set right now, like how to diagnose yourself. Right. Like I'm making you think right now, and I'm making you like, process this or watch your swing. Hey, what do you see? Right. I could just give you the answer, like, or, this other thing. Right. But like, again, like I'm developing that like over time. Right. So, like we talked about, it's like, in the beginning, great, I'm, providing you a base level education, but like I'm taking care of most of what I'm programming you, and like you're going to follow all these things, right? And then over time, I love having players that I've had for years, because then we get to a point where it's like, okay, then I went into, and it's like, okay, I start asking them about how they feel about a certain drill that we're doing. Like, hey, how does this make you feel? Like, you really like this one? You feel like you connect with, this one better or this one better, right? And I start asking them those questions. And then you get to a whole point where it's like, hey, what have you been struggling on? Oh man, like I'm pulling off right now and spinning. Okay, great. How are you going to make sure you're going to get better at that today? And they're like, oh, I was thinking I was going to do this. Like, okay, well, how can you guarantee today that you're better at that? Like, how are you going to make that? Like, what's your feedback? Like, how do you know you're getting better? What can we do to make sure that you're getting better at that today? Right. And I'm just guiding them. And then, but again, we couldn't start their day one.
No.
Right. So then we get all to that point, and then as we've had, years that we've developed this over, right, and they know their body and they know what they need to do, then, again, it just opens up a whole nother thing. But like, again, like a lot of times I'm like, that's coaching, that's teaching, like all those other things, right? So, I think that's a big place of, with it as well, is like, again, right now, I know a lot of things like, Muay Thai wise, right? That I can do now, right? But in the very beginning, my first day when I was learning martial arts, like if you'd have told me, what are you going to do to work on your switch kick today or something, I'd be like, what? Like, what do you mean? Like, I don't know any drills for that. Like, I don't know what I'm even feeling. I don't even know what the problem is. You know what I'm saying? So I think that's like just the thing for like, again, like coaching wise, it's not this or that or one thing or another or X, Y, and Z. And that's where, like, to start with our original topic that we came back to, right? And yeah, and just tying it back into the original, like, convo that we're having is like with it, right? It's like in the very beginning and along with that is like, okay, great, all that stuff, but like creating also, that culture that you have where of understanding, like, as a coach, like, what am I making a priority and what's important and how does it all feed into one another, and like the complexity of all that and the complexity of a human being where like you think it's just like it's either this or that, or it's like, oh, it's just this movement thing. It's like, yeah, but like that movement thing again is starting. It's like that's a symptom of a much bigger thing. And like, yes, I'm trying to get them to move better too, but sometimes I need to talk to them about like what's going on, or like, for example, they might think that that's like embarrassing in front of their teammates, right? So like I have conversations. I had a conversation with one of our players the other day. She plays at a Power 5, all those other things, like one of the top ranked teams in the country. And like we had a conversation. I'm like, hey, like, you guys will be doing drills and all these other things that are very unconventional, X, Y, and Z. Like, how do you process it? Because like they don't have a problem doing any of these things in front of any of the other players. They don't care. Like, obviously people will say something, they don't care. So I'm like, hey, like, how are you thinking about that? Like, what are ways that you process that? And then I take stuff from them and then I bring it over to another athlete. And I'm like, hey, like, well,
right,
blah, 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 share with me that this is kind of how she thought about it, or he thought about this, or he thinks about it this way, or when he's facing a sinker ball guy, he's thinking this, or when he's facing a guy with high spin, then he's thinking this. And then I have all of those things to pull from and use also from other players' experiences, and then stack those on top as well, where it's like, yeah, it's like, it's not that the drill isn't working, it's just that like they're not doing it because like their teammates like make fun of them or something. You know what I'm saying? It's like now, again, is the drill the problem, like, or is there other things that are the problem, like to make, like, what is the hang up? Yeah. Figuring out what the hang up is and solving that problem rather than it just being like, X's and O's. Like, it's just, there's just so much more to it. And like, that's the art side of it.
Yeah. And I'll take two quotes that credit to the high schoolers, because they've been teaching me a lot recently that I've been able to use with other hitters. I had one, I think it was last week, and it was one of my favorite quotes I heard from one of them was I showed him video and I let him go through and look at his videos that I had. And then he just laughs and he looks at me and goes, that looked a heck of a lot better than it felt. And I was like, that was kind of funny to me because he is literally like, at the end of that session, I was just so mad because it just did not feel the way I wanted it to feel. And I'm looking at those swings and I'm like, seeing how the ball's coming off the bat. And I was like, kind of juiced to leave today. Like that was a pretty good session. Like completely went from like bad session, angry, to like today was awesome. It was great. And so I thought it was kind of a funny one because it's like, stealing from the hitters, but also too going back to the thing of like, okay, perspective wise, right? Not only as a coach but as a player, right? You can go back and look at that swing and see so many different things based on where your head's at, right? And then the second quote they'll use is a kid that finally got up to varsity, finally plays varsity, and hasn't yet. Got some opportunities, didn't do so hot in his first varsity games, and was like, I just only saw curveballs hitting in the middle of the lineup, hasn't played varsity ever. And I was like, you're batting third on varsity. Like, you think you're getting fastballs down the middle?
Fastballs? Yeah.
And it was like, which we've talked about, but, like juice is flowing, wants to do good, blah, blah, but completely like blacks out. And, his first instinct was like, okay, so why? Whoa, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, can you hit a curveball? Well, yeah, but can you hit a curveball? Yeah. Was a curveball that good? What was the was umpire? What was really the problem? Yeah. And then he kind of like walked away for a little bit, walked back, and was just like, I was still mentally the JV 8-hole in that game, as I like took myself there mentally because I felt like that's where I belonged. I hadn't convinced myself that I am the 3-hole in varsity yet. And he was like, so I needed that because I can look back at that game and be like, I was hitting 3-hole on varsity, but mentally I was 8-hole on JV.
Yeah.
Like I was stuck in last year's body essentially with my mentality.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a super valuable nugget, and was like, they play this weekend, so we'll see how it goes. But, I thought that was a really good like recognition, self-reflection moment from him, just to have that. And then again, too, if he goes back and looks at those videos, I'm sure too, it's like, just like we started off this looking at like old videos and what we think, and then what we know now is like, I'll probably look at that and be like, that was awful. But with context, where was he at? Why did it happen? It's all important, and it's all building up to what you're becoming, as you continue to grow and get older. So, those are just two really cool nuggets I felt like, kind of feed into this conversation. It's like, it's all growth, and it's all, development, in all different aspects of the swing, from mental side to, your game plan strategy right beforehand, to your movement, to, the spiritual side just of your life in general, and like balancing all of it. And so they all kind of go hand in hand.
I like one of the things that Tewksbury's asked before too is how many swing and misses does it take for you to lose confidence?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of players feel really confident until they swing and miss at the first ball.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's the second ball. Maybe you struck out twice today, haven't touched the ball all day, right? When he asked that question, he's like, how many swings does it take? I told him -2. You know what I'm saying? It's like that, but again, like mentality-wise, it's like understanding, right? Sometimes you're seeing the guy warm up on the mound and you're immediately already defeating yourself,
crap,
right? You're going like, oh, he's throwing hard. Oh, he's got these, like, he's got some funky shapes. Like immediately, like you're already going in that space, rather than going into a place of like, okay, all right, like you definitely got some velo, like a different way of doing it. Like, okay, got some velo, have some weird shapes, other things. Okay, like what could I do to give me the best chance of like success here, right? Do I need to close off a little bit? Like, do I need to eliminate certain pitches, right? Like this is where I start, when you start getting like higher of, not necessarily when you're like 12, right? But like at the same time, right? Like understanding that as well, right? And just also like we talk about, like most high school pitching just isn't good enough, right? To like really challenge you in like those ways where you can still get hits. So like you're going to get your fastballs, you're going to get your other stuff, or, again, even with that, right? Like secondary pitch isn't that good, right? So it's just like, you're not super worried about it. But when you start getting, you start going up in levels and like you see like, or you actually see a good slider for the first time in your life, and you're just like, yo, like I heard all these people talking about sliders, but like I've never seen a slider like that. Yeah, all of a sudden you're like, whoa, okay, yeah, that thing sucks because it looks like a fastball and literally shoots away from me, and and now I'm in that, and the guy also throws 93, and and then with some arm side, and like they go opposite directions. It's very difficult, and how do I hit that, and what do I do? And then welcome to baseball, right? Like this is tough, right? So I think that's the other pieces as well. It's like, again, like all of that goes in, and like what needs to be told at certain times. There's certain times with athletes that I'm like really building them up, right? And there's certain times where I'm kicking them in the ass, right? And I'm like, yo, like, let's go. Like, you're better than that. Like, you're being, like, again, like I literally told a player the other day, I'm like, you're being a little puppy. Like, you're being a little puppy. Like, you need to step up. Like, it's your time and all those things. And like, there's another point in the season that I wouldn't have had that conversation. Right. And there's certain players that I can challenge certain ways and go, yo, like, that's not what all stars do. Yeah. You're an all-star. Like, get your shit together. You know what I'm saying? And then there's times where I'm like, yo, like the other way, different tone, wholly different thing. Like, and I'm building them up, and I'm like, again, half the time there's certain players that I'll text almost every week in every series. And I'm like, hey, you're one of the best softball players on the planet. You're one of the best baseball players on the planet. Like, don't forget, you know what I'm saying? Like, and I'm reminding them, and I'm building them up and all these other things, right? And there's other times I'm like, yo, you suck right now. Like, and it just matters the athlete, the time, the place, and like what they need to hear, and like what we need to talk about, and like always being truthful with them. I'm never lying to them. Like, I'm not saying something that like I don't mean, like, again, like they are one of the best, softball players. They might be one of the best baseball players on the planet or whatever, right? Like, that's, again, it just, like, I think that's the other thing with coaches too, is like when you say things and you're like lying to your players, either good or bad, it doesn't matter. You're blowing smoke, or you're telling them things like, hey, you need to make that play, and like no one's making that play, right? Or like, stuff like that. It's like, again, you need to have real conversations, so that when you do give compliments or you do give criticisms, like they lean in and they understand that, like, you're not lying to them, you're not leading them like astray, or just trying to get them fired up or something like that. Because then you start sounding like white noise to them, and they just start zoning you out at some point.
Well, I mean, I think a big one that can save you from that is like, I think a big question you can ask all your players is like, what standard do you want to be held to? Let them communicate it, because most of them are going to say high standards, right? I want to play pro ball. I want to do this. I want to do that. I want to be all state, this and that, right? And then when you're working with them, and one of my favorite ones I've been doing now, I know Caden over here has probably heard me do it, is I'll let them deem whether that they achieved the task or did the job now. And I'll just like, what standard do you hold yourself to? Did that meet your standard? Did that? Okay. Just making sure, you know, and it's like, let them think like, yeah, that was a ground ball to the right side, but you know, I sliced it that way. I didn't really like drive it that way or something, you know, like I got thumbed, right? And it's like holding them to the standards that they communicated to can really help but not feel like white noise. And, you know, that's a whole nother topic, I think.
Yeah. No, that's good though. But yeah, no, so I think it's all those things. And I think, you know, again, obviously as a coach over time, right? Like, yeah, as a reminder, like I'm a way better coach than I was, you know, than before. And again, it might not be in the ways, like there are certain seasons of my like coaching life where I was studying biomechanics like so deep, or physics so deep, or so, you know, things, right? And there's times where I go back to those and all that stuff, right? But it's like also too, like right now, I would say probably for me the last 2 years or so, it's been like very like people and like learning, understanding like people, and like you know, I think that that's a big pace. Now, it doesn't mean that movement is important. It doesn't mean that all those other things aren't important. It's like, no, I just like, and again, I'm, you know, obviously, as you know, right, it's not one thing at a time. Like I'm still doing all these other things too. It's just what area am I more focused on at what point? And like, I think that's another thing. Is just like, you know, the relationship standpoint is like the whole point is to get players results. So like, where do I also thinking of myself almost like an athlete, right? Or thinking about yourself as like, again, on the same side of that, like me as a coach, I want to be better, right? So what areas do I need to continue to focus on for me so that I can better serve? What are the big rocks? Like, man, okay, if I had this skill, like this would really help me. Like, man, if I was just a little bit more patient, or have more self-control, or didn't get upset in those moments, or, you know, when our team got their ass, you know, handed to them, like, and the thing is like how I responded in that coaching meeting afterwards, or how I made our players feel, or at practice, when we're, you know, like, bro, I remember, dude, our teams were so scared when I would coach, like high school, it was like infield, outfield. Our team was so afraid of infield, outfield because of me. Because I just had a really high standard for infield, outfield. Like I'm like, yo, it's gonna be crisp, it's gonna be clean. Like I'll restart every time. Like so, and then in game, I would shut it down. I'm like, everybody, I'll be like, get off the field. Like I would shut it down in the middle of it. Like I was just bad with it, right? Like so, again, there was like things like that where it's like, you know, playing wise. And I remember I used to have certain coaches like you make an error and like they lose their mind the day. Right? And then you're just like, again, like, dude, there's a whole bunch of players that's not going to work for. Like other players, I'm like, it's fine, like whatever, I'll, you know, whatever. But like, there's other players just like, dude, I hate playing for this guy.
The worst is you make an error, they don't say anything, and then you just don't go out next inning.
They just put somebody else in.
But you weren't even mad. You weren't even like visibly mad, but like I know you're mad.
Obviously you switch that up. But anyways, all right. Good. Let me pray us out and see where we're at. Then, Father, thank you so much for today, God. We just ask that you continue to open our hearts and bring awareness to areas that we can continue to grow and develop. We just ask that you make us, help us become better coaches, help us become better people so we can serve one another, and help us just follow you. And we just ask all these things in Jesus' mighty name. Amen. Amen. Well, until next time, Farm System out.